to Washington now to speak to Sherwin Bryse-Pease. Sherwin is in New York. So, Sherwin, we spoke about this earlier on. Nick was just giving us the various key states to watch and the margin that would be important. He mentioned that Pennsylvania has 20 electoral votes, Georgia has 16, North Carolina 15, and Nevada 6. But I want to talk about Georgia and the expectations there in the governor's race. It's got a large black population, a significant middle-class black population. We're just speaking with former Ambassador Patrick Gaspard earlier on about South Africans or other people outside of America wanting to understand what are the influences and what people are or have likely voted. So if we look at Georgia, what are the main issues there? It's got a growing black electorate, as I mentioned.
I mean, I really think the main issue, whether you speak about Georgia, Tsepiso, or large parts of this country, has either been you're for Donald Trump or not. Remember, we are in the midst of a pandemic here, and the narrative certainly that we have become accustomed to is that this election was going to be a referendum on Donald Trump. And as we discussed earlier, this was not a popularity contest between Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden perhaps wasn't the first pick of many Democrats in here, but you also saw during that primary process how the Democrats rallied around Biden when it became clear that a decision had to be made, even when Joe Biden wasn't necessarily winning from the beginning. And it was that black vote in the Carolinas, first in South Carolina and then North Carolina. And the role here of the black demographic in a state like Georgia, which has, they call Atlanta the black capital of the United States, the African American capital of the United States. And there is no question that Georgia has now tipped the balance in this election in many ways due to the work of a former gubernatorial candidate, Stacey Abrams, who, after losing a very close race for the governorship in 2018, took it upon herself to look at the voting rights issue in that state and around the country. She mobilized people from the ground up. She got millions of more people, not millions, but hundreds of thousands certainly, to register. We had a lot of new first-time voters in the state of Georgia based on how close she came to becoming the governor of that state, falling short by a few votes, really mobilizing ground forces to ensure that Georgia, for the first time since 1992, voted for a Democratic presidential nominee. So there is no question that that demographic base of Atlanta and the suburbs, remember the suburbs that surround these metropolitan areas, have been quite decisive in electing Donald Trump here, Joe Biden, who is now presumptive in many ways, certainly a trajectory here to become the president-elect, although nothing is confirmed until it's confirmed. But certainly the black demographic, the big cities and the suburbs have played a decisive role, whereas Donald Trump has dominated certainly in the rural areas, Tsepiso.
Sherwin, I think, as you mentioned, the most important thing here is, every vote counts, but it'll also talk to who controls Congress, the numbers there. That'll be important from a policy and acting point of view. So talk us through that as well.
Right, so, there was much talk before this election about a blue wave. Democrats, and certainly many people in this country, thought Democrats were going to sweep the Senate. They were going to solidify their and certainly extend their majority in the House. That didn't happen. A lot of Senate races that Democrats expected to win have gone the Republican way. It's a 50-50 balance right now with two runoff races in the state of Georgia, which will really determine who controls the Senate. So Democrats and Republicans will seek to win the two Senate races in Georgia on, I think, about the 5th of January. So just as soon as we wrap up this race, there are two key races in the state of Georgia that are going to determine who controls the Senate. But certainly Republicans, and this due to, in many ways, the popularity in the Republican Party of Donald Trump, really seeing a surge even in Republican votes here. But still very slim margins, Tsepiso, in the state of Georgia. Joe Biden now has a lead of about 1,500 votes, which is very minuscule. The Secretary of State in that state, Brad Raffensperger, speaking earlier, announcing that there will be a recount based on the margins. Under Georgia law, candidates can request a recount of a margin if the margin is less than 0.5%. So while counting has not concluded in Georgia, and they're still expecting military ballots to arrive from abroad, the sense we are getting is that in Georgia, because it's so close, too close to call right now, they're going to do a recount out of an abundance of caution. But let's Let's listen to how Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, framed this.
The focus for our office and for the county election officials for now remains on making sure that every legal vote is counted and recorded accurately. As we are closing in on a final count, we can begin to look toward our next steps. With a margin that small, there will be a recount in Georgia. Interest in our election obviously goes far beyond Georgia's borders. The final tally in Georgia at this point has huge implications for the entire country.
Georgia, of course, still more important in terms of Donald Trump's narrow path to 270 votes, less so for Joe Biden, Sepiso, who, of course, has also streaked ahead in the state of Pennsylvania that has some 20 electoral college votes at play, and that could move him from the 253 electoral college votes that have been confirmed, if you exclude the AP and Fox's projection that he will also win Arizona, where the race is also tightening. So if he prevails in Pennsylvania, that also gets him to 270. He's also now extended his lead, almost doubled his lead to over 20,000 votes in Nevada. Arizona has been called by some, but of course it's still tightening there. But the Biden camp still feeling very confident that they will get those numbers. And if anything is telling, we've heard from the Biden campaign that they will make a prime time address in the United States, 8 p.m. tonight, about 3 a.m. South African time. Kamala Harris expected to speak first, followed by Joe Biden. Will it be an acceptance speech? Will it be... It's not going to be a concession speech, but we certainly look forward to hearing what the former vice president has to say, and possibly the future president-elect.
So, Sherwin, as I see, obviously, the background behind you, the streets of New York, life is going on, including, I'm wondering what the word from the United Nations is, or at least world leaders. I've seen Germany calling for what it says, cool heads, restraint on President Trump declaring the elections or calling them fraudulent. Are other leaders commenting? We've seen silence from the UK. Has there been anything worthwhile to report?
You know, there hasn't, and it does raise many questions about the UN's relationship with the President of the United States. They've been very, very cautious in any sort of criticism directed at the United States. You know, before this election, when we had been reporting that there might be post-election violence, windows were being boarded up in cities, anxiety was high, we asked the Secretary General spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, why they, or not Stefan Dujarric, the Deputy Farhan Haq, why there was not a statement, given the fact that days earlier they had produced statements calling for calm in places like Ivory Coast ahead of that election. In Tanzania, they produced a statement, but nothing on the United States. We said, but if it's good for the goose, why not good for the gander? And the response was, we evaluate these things on a case-by-case basis. They will now, I think, wait until there's a final result. They are not going to inject themselves in this race just based on history. But we'll have to confirm that, Sepiso. I haven't spoken to anyone at the UN in the last 24 hours, but they're very reluctant to comment on anything that would, get a response from Donald Trump, particularly if Guterres were to be named on Donald Trump's Twitter feed.
So has he said anything on Twitter lately? We know that there's been radio silence because, as you mentioned, he's been flagged. But has he said anything? Has there been any reaction from the American people?
Well, there's dancing on the streets of Philadelphia. There's certainly scenes of joyous celebration by Democrats on the streets of Washington, and I imagine similar scenes populating the landscape of America. Not so much activity in Times Square. We're still in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic. There are not that many people. I mean, if I look behind me, you can see it's pretty empty in Times Square, which is normally a hub of activity, and that, I think, speaks to where we are in terms of this pandemic. Sepiso, over 120,000 new infections overnight, over 1,000 new deaths. So, as much as we talk about the numbers that are still coming in on the votes, the numbers in terms of the coronavirus pandemic in this country remain telling.
And that's a sobering point that we're all keeping in mind. Thanks a lot for that, Sherwin. Of course, we'll continue keeping up with Sherwin Bryse-Pease for an update on the elections in the United States. You heard him say Joe Biden is expected to speak today. That's at 3 a.m. South African time, 8 p.m. Eastern time, to find out whether or not he will be declaring, or at least accepting, the election as a US president, or is it an update on some of what's been going on? The threats of litigation, some states coming in saying that there will be a recount and they'll allow a legal challenge. Well, that's all here on SABC.